You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hi, hello and welcome to Digging Up Ancient Aliens. This is the podcast where we examine strange claims about alternative history and ancient aliens in popular media. Do the claims hold water to an archaeologist, or are there better explanations out there? We are now on episode 49. I am Fredrik, your guide into the world of pseudo-archaeology. But this time, I am not alone. I have PhD candidate Grace Reinhardt McRae, the time-traveling archaeologist, with me. We will learn about the Cathars and about one of their influential personalities, Esclarmonde of Foix, a woman that was very important among the Cathars and told to go back to the kitchen by the Dominican Order's founder, Saint Dominic. Esclarmonde also got the nickname the Fox for her ability to avoid the Catholic Inquisition. Grace will also take us back to Rennes-le-château, where we will revisit and learn more about the buried treasure that's supposed to be hidden in this small, quaint little French village. And some additional information can be added to our documentation after this. But remember that you can find sources, resources, and reading suggestions on our website, diggingupancientaliens.com. There you can also find contact info if you notice any mistakes or have any suggestions. And if you like the podcast, I would really appreciate if you left one of those fancy 5-star reviews that I heard so much about. Now that we have finished our preparation, let's dig into the episode. And then I want to welcome for the first time on a podcast, I think, Grace, or the time-traveling archaeologist. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much.
So you are a PhD candidate and an archaeologist and a medievalist. And you also do a bit of, what is it, Renaissance clothing? I think I've seen.
Historical
Historic in
costuming
general.
In my plethora of spare time.
Would you maybe want to share a little bit about your thesis?
Yeah, absolutely. So my PhD thesis is focused on the broadest stroke really is the use of myth and legend in heritage tourism. So I've taken a look at the southwest of France, which is Occitanie in modern French, or Occitania in medieval French. And this region is really kind of the perfect microcosm of my case study because of the Albigensian Crusade and the Cathars and the presence of a really kind of insane tourism campaign, which has kind of stripped the history from the region and instead replaced it with a ton of mythology and legends. So when people go there, they're looking for aliens, they're looking for the Holy Grail, they're looking for the Da Vinci Code, as opposed to this beautiful, rich history that is there and the fantastic archaeology that surrounds it. So it's kind of a microcosm of what I see, and I think a lot of people see happening at various heritage sites, especially in the rise of film tourism, where people are kind of visiting sites for maybe the wrong reason or a more destructive reason. And they're not there thinking about the archaeology and the heritage and the history. They're there thinking about something completely different that's irrelevant.
So you will fit right into this show. And the idea here is that we will discuss ancient aliens. And we have a segment here on the Cathars. I haven't punished you by forcing you to watch this, but you will get to listen to it at least.
Oh, boy.
And let's see how, because they start everything quite simple and calm. So let's listen to how they open the whole segment to see if you have any comments on that. And then we might get into the Cathars and their history.
Villa Rouge Terminus Castle, Languedoc, France. This medieval fortress, dating back to the 13th century AD, served as the final holdout of the Christian sect known as the Cathars. In 1321, the last known Cathar perfectus, Guilhem Belabasta, was burned at the stake here as part of the Holy Inquisition.
Do you have any comments? You looked a bit skeptical from the start.
Well, I've never heard Ville Rouge Terminés pronounced that way before. I've also never heard it called the last kind of refuge of the Cathars before. They were pretty much, at this point, exterminated. They didn't really have any last holdings since 1244 was kind of their final stand at a completely different castle in Carabous, which is in Languedoc, they're correct. But as far as I'm aware, their kind of stronghold in Ville Rouge fell far before that. But they did get it correct that Guilhem was the final perfectus, burnt at the stake. That was the official end of Catharism. It was in 1321. So 50-50 to start.
So if we rewind a little bit, who is the Cathars that they are talking about?
Sure. So the Cathars they're a Christian heresy, which basically just means, I'm sure most people know this already, but it basically just means they don't follow the letter of the Roman Catholic Church. The Cathars had some interesting ideas that aren't really all that different from a lot of other Christian heresies at the time. They're very similar to the Waldensians. You get some Lollard comparisons as well. But the Cathars are interesting in their belief in not just one God, but two. So they primarily believed that the Bible was the work of two different gods. You had the God of light, who was the God mentioned in the New Testament, and then you have the God of darkness, which was the God in the Old Testament. And one of their core beliefs was that humans, or people living on earth, were all people who were actually in purgatory, because their belief was that in actuality, a human soul was a genderless angel, and that angelic spirit belonged in heaven with the God of light, but had been trapped there on earth by the God of darkness. And it was a human's job to live the best, most pure, most perfect life that they could. And they would reincarnate time and time again until they had achieved that perfection and could finally be free of their human bodies and instead return to that angelic spiritual being. So one of the interesting things about them is that they actually kind of, for a medieval religion, they were really equal when it came to the treatment of men and women, rich and poor, because of that belief of the genderless angelic spirit in the human vessel. So they allowed and encouraged women to be preachers and monks as well as men. And one of the things that gets us into our ancient alien theories is that they revered Mary Magdalene alongside all the rest of the apostles as well. And with Catharism, they're basically the proto-vegans. They hated the thought of harming any living thing. They wouldn't eat meat. They allowed the lay people to eat meat and sort of, sustain themselves as they could. But in order to be a perfectus, or they're called bonne femme or bonne homme, good men and good women, in order to achieve that, you would have to basically live on a vegan diet and live in poverty and prayer a majority of the time. Yeah, I think that's the broad strokes of Catharism. It's what we're looking at.
So they sound a bit further ahead than maybe the people usually are viewed during this era. And I'm listening to it. We get some almost like Scientology mixed into it. Have you seen that too?
I have, I have noticed that as well. And I should start as well by putting out a disclaimer here, is that I am not pro-Cathar necessarily. I'm not saying this is the perfect religion or anything like that. I'm looking at the heritage they left behind, because the Languedoc region that they flourished in was at the time an autonomous region in the southwest. It was not really connected to the Kingdom of France. It was not really connected to the Kingdom of Aragon. They had a suzerainty agreement where the Counts of Toulouse and the Counts of Foix were Occitan. They weren't French, they weren't Spanish. They were Occitan, which is basically an offshoot of Catalan and Basque individual kind of culture. And the Occitan people sort of embraced Catharism because similarly they gave the same, not exactly the same, but a lot more leniency with women inheriting, women in rule, women in power. And the Occitan lords didn't really seem to care what religion their citizens practiced as long as they paid their taxes. So you have records of Cathars, Christians, Jews, Muslims, everybody living kind of side by side and not really kicking up a fuss about it unless someone forgot to pay their taxes. So my focus a lot of the time is really more on the Occitan people and the way they are remembered through the Cathars, because they are not really well remembered in any other way.
But the Cathar operated in a specific region, or was this a religion that kind of spread throughout France, or were they limited in their influential sphere?
They came from the east. So the theory is that they evolved from the Bogomils in Bulgaria and kind of came from the east to the west. So we have pockets of them in Italy, in northern France, in northern Spain, but where they really took hold and flourished was in Occitania because of that religious tolerance that the lords there allowed, whereas everywhere else it was really stamped out as soon as the first sign of it sort of reared its head.
They worked quite well with the other religions, you say. How was this reflected in the society? Do we have any documentation around this, or how can you see this in our historic records?
Yeah, we have historic records of people all sort of living side by side. And we actually have several threats from the Pope threatening to excommunicate the Occitan lords if they didn't start, stamping out the heretics that had taken hold. And more often than not, those lords just kind of said, yeah, okay, I'll get right on that. And then did nothing about it at all. So they were the Occitan people, the lords, were very independent of anything, really. Yeah, we have records of people living in small Jewish communities, in the same Christian communities. There are still actually some symbols carved on some medieval houses in a few of the smaller villages that include like the Star of David and the crescent moon of Islam next to the cross of Christianity, to show that the people in that household were welcoming to all of those other religions.
But were the Cathar in a position of power, or were they more just part of the larger group in the area? Because in the ancient alien show, they're depicted as a quite strong force that was combating the Pope's forces almost.
Mm-hmm. So it was much more popular among the lower class, among the peasantry. But it did gain some popularity amongst noble women, especially of the time. There's one woman in particular who I could talk for several hours just about her and her life. But Esclarmonde of Foix was one of the most famous Cathar bonne femmes. And she was actually on one of the council debates between the Cathars and the Catholics in a kind of a debate for the survival of Catharism. She sat on the debate and argued against Saint Dominic for the ability for Catharism to continue. So you did have a lot of powerful people begin practicing Catharism, but there were still just as many, if much more, Catholic lords who just didn't have a problem with Catharism.
But they were not part of the government of the region.
They were, only because of the lords that had converted to Catharism. But again, we see them cooperating just fine with their Catholic neighbors and things like that. Again, one of the big tenets of Catharism is peace and not harming any living things. And that very much extends to warfare. They didn't have any desire necessarily to go to battle outside of the usual territorial protection.
What was the name of the woman you brought up? My memory is a bit short.
Esclarmonde of Foix.
That's a completely new name to me, and it's always interesting to get the women, especially a woman that seems to have taken part of the Catholic councils. Would you maybe shed some light on her, because that's not a story that's really brought up in in the ancient alien narrative.
It's not a story. I'm not surprised they don't bring it up in Ancient Aliens, but it's not really a story that most people know or get told, even though it's an incredible story. No, it's so Esclarmonde is fascinating for a number of reasons, because she did what was expected of a noblewoman at the time. She got married in her late teens, early 20s. She had 6 children. She raised them to adulthood. And it was only after the passing of her husband that she began to look at Catharism. She'd always been sympathetic to them, but she began practicing herself, along with a few of her daughter-in-laws and all of her daughters. Her sons, some of them seemed to lean into Catharism, but most of them just seemed kind of supportive of it and remained Catholic in name. But with her daughters, she began forming these groups and having kind of these discussions with people, introducing them to Catharism, going out and helping the people of the region and kind of doing so in the name of Catharism. And she became so prominent. She was really well educated. She became so prominent that when it came time for this debate in 1207, she and her daughter Philippa were asked to serve with a lot of other Cathar perfectus men on this panel to debate against Catholic clergy. She was actually in her early 50s when this took place. And there is documentation which states that Saint Dominic actually yelled at her to go back to her bower because this was no place for a woman. And she stood firm and continued arguing that the most important thing here was that they be given a chance to practice and live. And after that, she became one of the main targets for the Crusaders. And they actually ended up calling her the Foxes of Foix, because she was never captured. She managed to evade everybody coming after her. We believe she died sometime in the 1230s, 1235, because she was last seen at a nephew's wedding and then never seen again.
So it's interesting that the go to the kitchen, make me a sandwich argument have been used for, what is it, 800 years or something like that?
A long time.
I'm not surprised, actually, but so she was one of the last few influential people of the Cathars, which is rather interesting. But actually, when I've read about it, she never pops up in the common sources, really, but she seemed to have been quite an important character about it. Is it because this type of the research into the Cathar has been male dominated, or is it because they want to look more about this heresy angle and maybe don't really talk about the people in general?
Yeah, it really depends on the sources that you're looking at. She doesn't show up in a lot of sources that are written in a more modern sense. If you look at the more original texts, then you'll see her mentioned a few times. And we have different records of her activity throughout history that does survive. You'll see a lot that has been kind of brushed aside, or she won't even be mentioned by name because of, I don't really know why. There's been a lot of undermining of women throughout history, and especially in that region. My theory is that because the French kingdom eventually took control of Occitania, they weren't there on that level of equality with women yet. And so they kind of wanted to downplay her involvement. But actually where I found her most isn't in a lot of English sources. A majority of it is in the French sources, which isn't accessible to a lot of people. I would say probably a majority of people. It wouldn't necessarily be accessible, which is another reason why I'm so interested in talking about this and kind of getting it out there, because English, for better or for worse, is a more universally accessible language, and a lot of the information just isn't available yet.
That's quite common issue among several regions. For example, I've usually looked into Vikings, and there's a lot of research going on in the Baltic countries, Poland, Slavic speaking, but they speak or write it in their own language, so it's not as accessible as everybody, but it creates these knowledge gaps among ourselves. But it's good that you bring it forward, and with, well, AI for better and worse, we might be able to quicker translate this type of research, making it a bit more accessible, which is an upside, and we can discuss the utilization of AI and the backside too. But what do you see when we look at the tourism of these places? If we go to your thesis there, if we go to, I'm sorry for my French here, Montségur, or... and you complain about the narrator's pronunciation already. Villerouge Termines Castle.
There you go. Already better than him. Yeah, so it's interesting to see how it's presented, because the big tourism package is that it is the Cathar country. So they want the association with the Cathars, very much so. They have a whole chain of castles called the Cathar castles, which is what my thesis focuses on primarily, are these castles. And I've been to all of them now and kind of seen the varying levels of how they portray the Cathars and how they kind of explain the Albigensian Crusade and what happened here. And some of them do a fantastic job. Montségur, for one, is a really great interpretation of what happened. They have a stunning archaeology museum in the village down below, a really nice interpretation and visitor center. You have to climb for half an hour up nearly vertical mountain to get there. But, you know, if you do go and you make the effort, there's a memorial there because for people who aren't familiar, Montségur is commonly called the last stand of the Cathars because that's where a good number of them, including Esclarmonde of Foix, 3 of her daughters and 4 of her grandchildren were killed at Montségur because they fled to hide there. But 250 people were killed at Montségur, and there's a memorial to them there. But then you go and you look at other places, like the town of Béziers, where there was an enormous massacre. It's supposedly where we get the phrase, kill them all, God will know his own, from. And some high estimates say 20,000 people were killed there, but I don't think that's actually possible given the population at the time. But we are looking at close to around 7,000 people murdered, whether they were Cathar or Catholic. And in this whole village, there is not one memorial to what happened here. So you get completely different levels in the tourism of what you're actually seeing. And so much of it has to do with myth and legend and the supposed treasure or the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant, Da Vinci Code stuff instead of actual history.
Is it because that seemed to be more profitable, or is it just that these packages sell better, or have you looked into that part?
Yeah, with some places, it's definitely because it sells better. But I think with other places, it's just a general ignorance that they just don't really know the actual history very well. And so most people will push the narrative of the treasure and things because it's more exciting. You know, it's more fun for the family instead of serious people wanting to learn about history.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I've seen the tour packages sold by many of these ancient alien hosts. You can go and pay, what is it, 10,000 euro to go with Van Daniken to Egypt and all of that. So it sells quite well.
It does.
Why do you think they selected to go with Villerouge Termes instead of Montségur in this case? Because Montségur is the thing that seemed to be repeated in most of the documentation. Is it maybe tourism aspect? Because I know that some regions try to sell in that come here and make your alien show and, you know, get tourism in there. Or is it just that there had something happened there?
So honestly, for Villerouge, I think it's just because it's more accessible. Like I said, Montségur it's a hard climb. I'm a fairly fit person who's used to kind of doing these climbs, especially with my research. And Montségur is hard. It's hard to walk up. You can't, if you have any kind of difficulty walking or climbing stairs, you would not be able to make it all the way to the top. So it could honestly just be that Villerouge-Termenez just has nicer stairs. You can drive up to it. Whereas with Montségur, you really have to be interested and dedicated to getting to the top.
Might be why they don't have any talking heads on location for that episode, but it makes sense that they shows what's accessible, to be honest.
Yeah. And I mean, you do have the connection to this is where the last Cathar was burnt. That is true. That is the last recorded Cathar we have. He was burnt at Villerouge-Termenez. But it was so far after the bulk of what happened with the Cathars that it's interesting that they went there when they could have gone to so many other places. They could have gone to Aguilar. They could have gone to Carabous. They could have gone to Puy-le-Rens. These are all much easier climbs, but still have that kind of vista and the intrigue as well. So it's interesting they chose Villerouge.
I think it's because they wanted the last of something, because it's maybe more memorable. But again, part of my friends, Billy Bust, Guillaume, was he part of the Inquisition, or was he punished by the Catholic Church? Do you know if there was any inquisitions in the Cathar regions, or?
Oh yes, absolutely. There's actually an entire book. I brought a couple of my books up with me for show and tell. But there's an entire book about Guillaume and the Inquisition, which happened in a small town. And we have this book thanks to Jacques Fournier, who was the bishop in Pamiers and went on to become the Pope. So all of his papers, he took immaculate detail about the Inquisition. This is how we have a lot of the everyday person's story. And he took such good detail that then when it was preserved in the Vatican archives, we were able to pull it out and look and see day to day of what was happening and the Inquisition that Guillaume Bilbasta went through, along with a lot of other influential Cathars at the time.
So we preserve them in a way through the Inquisition process, but do you have any original text preserved from the religion, or is it just accounts by other people?
Yeah, most of the documentation, the original documentation, has been destroyed. What we have of Catharism is really sort of in that history is told by the victor viewpoint. So we have those Vatican records and the Inquisition records. We do also get a couple of 3 different people writing at various points who are contemporary to the story. We have one who's an Occitan troubadour, and he writes during the early part of the Albigensian Crusade. We have one who was a Cistercian monk with Bernard of Clairvaux, and he writes through the early part as well. And then we have someone who was born Occitan and raised Catholic, who kind of has an interesting middle ground perspective. And he comes in a little bit later and sort of ties up the story with us in a bow. So there are these 3 original texts, and they have actually been translated into English and a few other languages as well. So those are out there and accessible. But as for original documents for the Cathars, we have almost nothing.
What do you know about Rex Mundi?
Rex Mundi? Oh, not a lot. Do tell.
Let's see what the aliens have to say about it.
Oh, Lord.
It was heresy to believe that there is a force as strong as God, and the Cathars certainly believed that. The Cathars believed in an evil force, a force that was here to corrupt humans. The Cathars referred to this force as Rex Mundi. Rex Mundi means the king of the world. He is essentially a type of demon. Rex Mundi will lead you from your path with material temptations.
Interesting. I have not come across that name in my research. I've been looking into the Cathars for 3.5, almost 4 years now, pretty exclusively. And that's not a name I'm familiar with. I know I've I've heard little bits and pieces, maybe on the more esoteric side of things about Rex Mundi, but I think what they're trying to talk about is the whole idea that there are two gods.
Yeah.
They're the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament. And I think they're probably trying to give the dark God, the God of the Old Testament, the name Rex Mundi, when in reality it's just Satan. It's just the devil. He would have been referenced as the devil.
Yeah, the whole idea with just this episode that this is from is that there is good aliens and bad aliens, and the bad aliens are those who cause mental health issues. And I guess the Cathars in that sense are a good use for this type of idea, but
I guess so. I guess, you take the people who already believe in two different deities and throw aliens at it, anything will stick. But, oh boy. No, I don't think so. I found nothing in my research to indicate aliens are part of any of this.
Oh, bummer. Here I thought we had really stunned the expert.
No, I will say there is reference to aliens in this region. The mountain of Bugurach, the Pic de Bugurach, is a phenomena called kind of an upside down mountain because the geological layers are kind of flipped upside down thanks to the different tectonic plates. So when people first started going out there and noticing that, they were like, this mountain is upside down. It must have been lifted and turned upside down by the aliens in their spacecrafts. But it's just plate tectonics doing their thing. But people believe so strongly in the aliens of this region that in 2012, do you remember when the world was supposed to end in 2012?
Yeah, I remember.
Calendar. Yeah, weren't we all hoping? But so many people believed that Bugurach was where the aliens would come save them, that about 10,000 people gathered by this mountain in a village of 200 residents. And it scared the French enough that they called out the military to make sure there weren't any mass suicides. So I have another book here called Le Montagne Inversée, which is written by two journalists who had been sent to cover the 2012 phenomena. And then they revisited the idea and everything that had happened 10 years later, finding it all to be nonsense, of course.
As usual, but you know that the world really ended, but on a metaphysical level.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, you just don't see it.
People just don't get it.
And then they sell another course instead. But have you seen any ancient alien tours when you've been looking at the different pseudo or type of excursions? Yeah,
I have. I've actually encountered some of them in real life. When I'm at the sites doing my research, there will be these groups of people who kind of come up and just sort of sit and commune with the area around them. And you'll get invited. I've been invited actually on a couple of them, these spiritual retreats to go and commune with nature in these sites and speak to the higher powers that surround us. So yeah, it's
have you taken them up on the offer?
I haven't yet. No. Another interesting phenomena that happens in this region is people will come up to you and be very familiar because they're convinced that you've met in a previous life. And there's this belief in the region that everybody who moves there was actually the spirit of a reincarnated Cathar moving home. So I've been approached by many people saying that we had past lives together as Cathars, which is interesting. It could be, if you find the right old lady, it could be a very good dating system. Because I've had an old woman approach me and say, you used to be married to my son. He's just over here. Come meet him. So she shot her shot. But I was sitting with my husband at the time, so it didn't work out for her.
Your husband didn't want to give you away.
Well, no, we were speaking in French, and he doesn't speak French yet, so he was just smiling and nodding the whole time. He was ready. He was ready to give me away.
Last castle she dragged me up to.
Yeah, I know it.
I think I will, since we're talking about aliens, make your life a bit more spicy and interesting. And we will go to a different region in France, Rennes-le-château. That, of course, is famous for its treasures, its connection to the Visigoth, and a special church there. We have talked about it in the past, but this is another of your research interests, as I understand it.
Yeah, so I actually did my master's on Rennes-le-château.
So you know everything, and if you don't know it, we know that Ancient Aliens was right. A lot on stakes here. But I will play you a little clip again.
Before Marie's death, she had promised to tell someone the secret. I will tell you the secret, and you will be rich beyond your wildest dreams. And what she said was, the people of this village walk on enough gold to make them wealthy for 100 years, and they have no idea. And the secret, she was never able to speak it after she had her stroke. So what was Marie talking about?
Well, what was Marie talking about?
That's a great question, because we don't know. We still don't know. And the reason we don't know is because archaeology has actually been banned in Rennes-le-château since 1965. And that is primarily because before then, a ton of treasure hunters had heard what Marie said and started digging into the village and under the mountain that it's on. So much so that the mayor said that it was beginning to look like Swiss cheese with all the holes. So I'm very familiar with Marie, thanks to my research and my master's. And this whole thing is really fascinating because there is an actual mystery here. We actually have something that people could be focusing on and using as like an unsolved mystery. And they completely miss it. It goes completely over their heads. And instead they want to make it something completely different than it is. They want it to be fantastical. They want it to be the Holy Grail or Mary Magdalene or whatever it is. But the reality of it is that in the late 1890s, a priest in Rennes-le-château, an impoverished town, which did not have running water or anything like that, was suddenly able to begin restoring the church, building himself an extravagant place to live, giving the village running water, increasing the standing of everybody in the village. Suddenly he had all of this money to draw on, and we have no idea where it came from. We have no idea. There are a lot of different theories, one of which includes laundering masses, so selling more masses than he would ever be able to perform, which I do believe is part of the truth. But there's also a story that comes to us which tells of the first grant, the priest, Abbé Saunière, Béranger Saunière, which if you're familiar with the Da Vinci Code, you'll be familiar with the Saunière name because Dan Brown stole it. But Abbé Saunière had gotten a gift from a wealthy benefactor to replace the altar and the floor of the church. This is a 10th century church, which had basically been crumbling into disrepair since the 1400s. And he got this grant, this money, to redo part of the church. And he was digging beneath the altar with two other men. And one of the men told his daughter the story of what happened. And she wrote it down. So he said that they were digging beneath the altar and they found a skull belonging to somebody who'd been buried there ages ago, he thought, in the Middle Ages. They found a carved stone, which is known as the Chevalier or the Knight's Stone today. And they saw something glittering in the ground. And at that point, the priest told them, "It's lunchtime. Go take a break. I'll handle this." And when they came back, the skull and the stone were still there, but they thought they must have imagined something glittering. So we have this record of this being found. And then instead of saying, "Oh, he must have found a cache of treasure. He must have found a cache of this or that," people are saying immediately, Holy Grail. Holy Grail, Ark of the Covenant, something phenomenal. And, you know, it wasn't an uncommon practice for the longest time. I'm sure you'll be familiar as a Viking scholar, for people to bury wealth in the ground, to people to kind of hide treasures or offerings of gold and things like that in the ground. It's not an uncommon thing, but nobody went there. Nobody thought, this place which was ravaged by a crusade, I wonder if maybe one or two of the lords buried their treasure beneath the altar of the church. They go immediately to something esoteric, something beyond. But when in reality, there's like an actual concrete mystery staring us in the face because we don't know.
Don't worry, because I have the solution to all your questions here.
Oh, boy.
Baron Chassonnière is a guy who goes in search of ancient documents, who goes in search of certain specific knowledge in alchemical circles. So what we have found in an awful lot of alchemical processes is the importance of gold. What happens next is that he begins to build a church. He builds it according to a plan. This plan is make contact with the divine. And so I think Chassonnière realized that certain metals could be transformed into something which truly made it a spiritual experience.
And then we know that the treasure is, of course...
This wealth that he had was part of a vast golden treasure that was kept underground in this church in a weird series of catacombs. These catacombs at Rennes-le-château were ancient. They'd been there long before the church had been built. And here's an area that's known to have these caves that were used by the Visigoths.
Well. Look at that. They've solved it for us.
Yeah, it's Visigoth that he found either before or during he was building his church, according to the plan. Is this a story that you hear often with the Rennes-le-château, or was this new information for...
No, it is unfortunately very familiar. Those of you listening couldn't see the way I buried my head in my hands, but I'm very familiar with this idea of the church being purpose-built to commune with the divine and to unlock esoteric mysteries. I'm going to ruin that for everybody right now because we've actually got receipts of where Chassonnière ordered some of these artifacts, these pieces that he added to the church. They came from a local church decorator in Toulouse, and they were all ordered from a catalog. They were already pre-made. All he had to do was go through and pick which ones he wanted. And they're pieces that are found throughout a ton of churches in the southwest of France.
So his esoteric master plan was basically from the post-order catalog.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And we have receipts. We have everything. We have the catalog that he looked through. We know we have him basically circling pieces that he wants. And we see how much he paid for them. So, yeah, Ancient Aliens didn't get that one right, unfortunately.
Bummer. But do you think we will be able to... Because I've never actually heard that it was banned with excavations in this little town. Do you think they will lift it soon, or is it just we don't want treasure hunter here? How is the tourism in this place? Have you looked into that, or is this a little bit after your...
It is completely after my main area of focus, but it is, again, I did my master's thesis on it, titled Heritage as a Hoax. Because the whole thing was created in the 1950s. The man who purchased the land from Marie Denarnaud, who was the Marie they were talking about earlier, he made this whole thing up to get tourists to come to the town. It was specifically created as a tourist trap, as a tourist plan. And he just so happened to have a treasure hunting group that he loved to bring around and show off things to. And he wrote a bunch of documents about the history of Rennes-le-château, which were then placed in the Bibliothèque Nationale. And kind of then when people went in looking for history about Rennes-le-château, they found this account and pretty much nothing else. The Priory of Sion was founded in a similar way, which is, again, if you're familiar with Da Vinci Code, the Priory of Sion was reportedly started in 1099 in Jerusalem. But in actuality, it was created in 1956 by a man called Pierre Plantard, who wanted to convince people that he was the rightful king of France through the Merovingian line. And it just spiraled so far out of control, and people kept coming in and digging and would be digging up graves. They have a padlock on the cemetery now because people would go through and dig up graves. But the whole thing just started as a tourist trap, and it continues to be to this day. And it's really unfortunate because there are some interesting claims. We may actually have those catacombs underneath the church. There are some GPR scans that show that it's possible. But I don't know that in my lifetime, France will allow anyone to actually excavate. They're very much saying a blanket no right now to anything.
All because someone was making up a little story. And the guy that purchased, if I don't remember very wrong, is Noël Corburite, was a restaurateur in France.
Mm-hmm.
But something that's often left out in the whole discussion, you brought up a little bit about where he got some of the money, but this is based on my own translation of France documents. And as you know, my French isn't the best. He was presented in the ecclesiastic court, Sanier, and convicted. Usually something that's left out of this narrative. Is it, again, because you only find this source in French, or is it just not as interesting because criminal priest might be even more better if you want to sell this story?
Yeah, I think it gets left out partly because of the language barrier, but mostly because it's just not as good a story. It's a much better story if there are no criminal charges, and it's just this priest with a massive wealth discovered from somewhere beneath his church, and he dies with the secret. But yeah, in reality, he was taken to ecclesiastical court 3 times at the end of his life. 3 different times. 3 times. And I think that says quite a bit about the number of masses he trafficked in and the amount of money he was able to make. But then we do still have that little nugget of somebody did witness him uncovering something. And we don't know what it is. So there's still a real mystery. I don't understand why people aren't excited about that instead of making stuff up.
Because, I don't know, people are no aliens. Because in this segment, they go off the rails towards the end, and I want to see if you have encountered these claims.
Okay.
We know that people have said that Rennes-le-château is a place for UFOs. We know people have reported time slip, and people have said that they have had encounters with the devil. So there is definitely something about that area which suggests that for centuries, very strange and bizarre things happen.
No. No, I haven't. I have not encountered any time slips or aliens or devils. I do know a couple of different reported encounters with the devil that happened in the Middle Ages, but those tend to be all over the world as well. We always have stories about people encountering the devil, various places. So we don't see it any more here in this region than anywhere else in the world.
Hotspot for supernatural stuff in general.
No, not really. Although I have spoken to a few different mediums in my research who say that there is a lot of energy in the region because of the atrocities committed during the Albigensian Crusade, which I would be more inclined to believe than anything about an aliens or the devil. When a lot of horror has happened in a place, I do think that you can kind of feel that, but not in like a spooky, there are ghosts looking over my shoulder kind of way. No aliens watching me from above sort of thing. Just a heaviness that is just kind of there when you know bad things have happened somewhere. And I think that's just within our own psyche.
But according to the ancient alien theorists, as they usually say in the show, it's written terriblis est locus iste on the church, or this place is terrible.
Yeah. A common mistranslation, which is meant to invoke the terrible might of God, not this place is terrible as in horrible bad things have happened, the aliens are coming. It's meant to invoke awe in God, nothing else.
But this place, to go back a little bit, it was part of the Cathar region, or do I misunderstand you? Because the French Crusades are new territory for me, at least.
So, yes, Rennes-le-château did exist during the time of the Albigensian Crusade. But unlike so many other villages in the region, it was not affected. The overlords of the area were Cathars, but though they lost their stronghold in that region within the first year of the crusade in this specific part of the region. And so Rennes-le-château remained Catholic and had a crusader overlord from 1210 all the way through the monarchy of France.
So the treasure could be Cathar, and that's how it could be the Cathar overlords that store their hidden or try to save their gold?
It could be. It honestly, it could be. It could have been that they knew that the Crusaders were coming, and so they buried their gold beneath the one place they assumed that anybody crusading for God wouldn't attack, the altar of a church. We have that burial there, the skull that I mentioned earlier that Saunière found. It actually has an injury. It was pierced with a halberd. So we know, thanks to carbon dating, that it belonged to a man who is between his late 30s, early 50s, who died between 1280 and 1314. So that's around the time of the Inquisition, and when there would have been battles still going on between the Crusaders and the Cathars, the Crusaders and the Spanish to the south. So it very well could have been something that was buried at that time, and that could be the Cathar treasure or even a Crusader treasure, if you want.
Do we still have the stone and the skull, or do we just have one of them?
So we have the stone. That is in the museum at Rennes-le-château. So you can go in and see a lot of the documents and the stone. It's all still there. And the skull is not on display. It was actually lost for quite a few years, about 50 years. It was lost. It was actually just returned in 2014 and sent to different labs, one in Carcassonne and one in Toulouse for different testing. And so I believe a group of anthropologists in Toulouse still have it.
Because, I mean, it would make sense if you want to hide something, to hide it with a body. As you say, there is a mystery, but not maybe necessarily an alien mystery, as someone might want to say. Or was it common in French grave for the era to add gold, for example, treasures or things for the afterlife in the grave? Do we see the same in the region for Christians, or is this, must it have been added? Do we see that type of grave?
We don't tend to see grave goods like that associated with Catholic or Christian burials. And we don't actually have any Cathar burials to examine, because if somebody was a known Cathar, their corpse was actually dug up and burnt as a heretic, along with any living Cathars that they had. So we actually only have 2 bodies of Cathars, and they were not buried in a normal manner. It wasn't common to bury treasures like that with most Christian burials in the region, but it is common to hide things under altars. And it could very well be that the treasure was added later, because during the French Revolution, there was this time of turmoil when a lot of Catholic clergy were fleeing to Spain or to Italy to try to avoid the revolutionary persecution. And we do have record from one of the previous priests at the church that he did bury some of his wealth at Rennes-le-château before he left, and he died in Spain, so he was never able to come back and claim it. So it could very well be a stash from the late 18th century as opposed to the 13th or 14th.
So we have a few different threads of what the treasure could be that nobody seemed to really care about, interestingly, because that sounds
nobody seems to be following. It sounds so much more plausible, doesn't it?
I mean, if the Catholic priest hide his treasure, I mean, if I were a priest, I would put it somewhere where I could easily go and get it later, as in a church sense. Who expect that priest? And even if the revolutionaries probably were a bit upset with the church, they were most likely Christians and would have probably more respect for the church than, raiding the priest home, for example. They would just tear out everything nail by nail if they needed to find whatever they were looking for. So, I mean, it makes sense if you want to hide something in the church.
The logic is there. It's just a step that so many ancient aliens people kind of jump over instead.
It's not connected to any sort of, I know that some crusaders or knights left treasures and swords. For example, those surviving Battle of Agincourt left their swords in particular church. It could not be connected to some sort of tradition. Or are you not familiar with that in this particular church?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that tradition in other places, but there is no evidence of that happening in this particular church. I cannot understate how important this church was. There was no importance of this church whatsoever outside of the people living there. At the highest population that we have record for, there were 300 people living there. Currently, there are 72 full-time residents. So it's not a huge church. It's not a big, important church in the area. Rennes-le-château is certainly not the biggest village in the area. It's a 10-minute drive to another much bigger village with another church. So I don't know, aside from Noël Corbu and his myth, what made people interested in this village, which is maybe why he did it, to try to bring back some tourism money and encourage people to come to Rennes-le-château again. But it's not that important. It's not.
What's your favorite pet theory about Rennes-le-château? Do you have any? If I could decide what is true or that I want to be true, what do I want it to be then?
I think, personally, with all of the research I've done on it so far, I believe that Saunière found some small stash of gold or silver that had been left there, maybe by the Crusaders or maybe by the priest from the 1700s. And I think he found that. And then he was also trafficking in masses. And he was also known to entertain people in his estate. Some of the more famous entertainers and dancers at the time liked to come down and spend time with him there. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was a combination of a small fortune in that gold from beneath the altar and then just scamming his way into the rest. That's what I personally think it is.
Then we're a little bit on the same page. I didn't know about the treasure under the altar. I didn't know that he was up 3 times. I thought it was just 2 times. But I think we will put an end here. And Grace, if people want to hear more of you or learn more about what you're doing, where should they head off?
So I have a presence on TikTok and Instagram. Both are at the Time Traveling Creative. Or you can search the Time Traveling Archaeologist and find me just as well. Always happy to answer people's questions on either platform about the time period, about heritage tourism. I go on a lot of rants about not looting and not doing graffiti on various sites. So yeah, come find me there and say hello.
And if people want to read your master, is that possible? Do you have it online or should they just reach out to you? Do you have it on Academia or any other of those sites, for example?
I haven't put it on Academia yet. I am planning to do so soon. So you can keep searching Academia until I actually get it up there, or you can send me a message on either TikTok or Instagram and I'd be happy to share it with you from there.
Awesome. And when do you think your PhD will be done? How much time do you have left?
I am projected to finish in 2025. Hopefully that will actually happen. So I should be defending in the fall of 2025 or spring of 26. And then hire me.
Definitely. And we hope to read about your research on the tourism trade there. Looking forward to it, but thank you very much for your time, Grace, and I hope that we sync up one other time, because it was very interesting to hear what you had to offer.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely talking to you.
Again, thank you so much, Grace. And I just want to say that if everything goes as planned, the next episode will most likely be recorded live online, allowing you to ask questions if you have any. To get more info about that, keep an eye out on the social media where soon more info should follow. Now, until then, please spread the word by leaving a positive review on platforms like iTunes, Spotify, or, even better, among your fellow trench dwellers. For more information about me and the podcast, check out diggingupancientaliens.com. There you also find an extensive list on sources and resources and reading recommendations for those eager to expand their knowledge and on the subject matter on the episode page. If you want to support the show, you can head over to patreon.com/diggingupancientaliens. Or if you want to get the most out of your buck, head over to the archaeologicalpodcastnetwork.com, where you will get a ton of bonus content, Slack channels, and ad-free episode. That membership covers every show that's within the network, so you get a great amount of content for your hard-earned money. If you want to contact me, it can be done through most social media sites, and if you have comments, corrections, suggestions, or if you want to write that email in all caps, you find my contact info on the website. Sandra Martelor created the intro music, and our outro is by the band called Trallskruv, who sings their song Foliehatt. Links to both of these artists can be found in the show notes. Until next time, keep shoveling that science.